Finally got out, when they finally opened the doors for him again, they put him in another prison. It was like an ersatz release. They put him in another prison, which was Kaikoura.
Getting beaten down again and again, many speculate that Ron may have taken his own life. But there's an issue with the suicide scenario. Ron Jorgensen's car appears to have run off the road the night he disappeared, but there was no one found in it. His Cortina had come to rest upside down on the rocks south of Kaikoura, with its roof crushed in and all 4 doors jammed shut. Detective Neville Stokes concluded that if there'd been a driver in the car when it went over the cliff, that person's body should have been trapped inside the vehicle. To verify his theory, we've brought in a team of experts to re-examine the crash. The first factor to establish is the speed the car was going at when it left the road.
Observation stored.
By using the latest laser technology to measure the height of the cliff and the distance the car travelled after it left the road, we can determine the speed of the Cortina and its trajectory as it crashed to the rocks below.
Observation stored. Changing phase.
The data gathered along with photos of the original scene have been sent for analysis to Professor John Raine, a vehicle crash analyst at the Auckland University of Technology.
In this case, what turns out is that the vehicle has gone off the edge of the cliff very, very slowly, and it's rotated off the edge of the cliff and effectively gone down the face of the cliff into the water and onto the rocks.
Using the measurements, we've created a number of animations to illustrate the path of Ron Jorgensen's Cortina. If the vehicle had been travelling even at a moderate speed, its trajectory would have taken it at least 20 metres beyond where it was discovered at the base of the cliff. But at a speed below 20 kilometres per hour, the car follows the path described by Professor Raine.
The tyre marks that I've been shown in photographs lead up to the edge of the cliff. They're not consistent with the vehicle having left the road out of control and slid towards the cliff.
Taking into account the sighting by the truck driver who saw the Cortina stationary with its front wheels hanging over the edge of the cliff, the evidence indicates the car was going so slowly that it initially grounded on the banked edge.
I have seen a photograph that indicates some gouge marks on the edge of the softer material just at the top of the cliff. That would suggest that a vehicle has been pushed over the cliff rather than having been driven over.
Having studied the speed, trajectory and damage to the vehicle, Professor Raine can now judge whether a body could have been flung out of the car on impact or would have stayed trapped inside.
The doors on the vehicle were closed at the time it was found. And looking at the crush damage to the roof of the car, this would suggest that it would not have been possible for a driver to escape from the vehicle after it landed on the rocks.
All the evidence indicates there was no one in the vehicle and that it was pushed over the cliff. This rules out accidental death and makes suicide highly unlikely. The only other possible explanation is that Ron Jorgensen deliberately disappeared. Desperate to escape his hometown or on the run from old enemies, Jorgensen had the motivation to leave. The question is, where did he go and how?
I thought, well, what better way to go? Get picked up at your doorstep and off to Aussie, no time.
"18 years after the gangland-style killings at Bassett Road, Ron Jorgensen was released from prison on strict conditions. He was sent back to Kaikoura, the small town he'd been desperate to escape from as a boy, and forced to remain there on life parole.
Kaikoura at the time was a small, sleepy little seaside town where nothing much happened. pretty well a dead-end dump where there was nothing to do.
He had no job to come back to, and as a condition of his parole, Ron had to live with his retired father.
His dad had lived by himself for a long, long time, turned off the power at night, so there seemed to be a struggle with hot water. Jorgie lived in a caravan separately out in the house, and they would certainly have a few arguments. I said to him, how would he like to come and earn a few bob and groom some cars for me? And he thought that was wonderful, to actually give him a chance to re-establish himself.
Valeting cars allowed Ron a brief escape from Kaikoura, delivering vehicles to Christchurch with permission from his parole officer. But it also gave him the opportunity to rebuild his illegal enterprises.
He would go, wait till the pub closed at 10 o'clock, he'd hop in this big Falcon of his, come to Christchurch, pick up stolen property, and he'd just get them back at daylight.
I hadn't seen him for probably 6 or 8 weeks, and I said to him, well, Jorgie, what have you been up to? And he said, I've been over at Della's place, helping her stack wood. And I said, oh gosh, I said, you're so kind the way you look after that lady. As it turned out, Jorgie stacking his wood had been stacking the wood nicely around and putting Nova roofing on top, and he had a cannabis nursery growing underneath it.
He would have continued as a matter of principle and as a matter of personal honour. He would have continued with criminal activity. He wouldn't have wanted administration to think they'd beaten him, and he wouldn't have wanted the criminal world to have thought that he had retired and that he'd been cowed by the authorities.
Ron appeared to have life under control. He'd reinvented himself as an artist, had his criminal income on the sly, and he'd met a new woman.
I didn't think he was a particularly good-looking man, but there must have been something about him. And he told me that he was coming back from Christchurch once, and he called in at the hotel, and this woman spotted him and came over and started to chat to him. So he invited her up to Kaikoura, and that was Anne, yeah.
He looked lost. If a stranger comes in, you make them feel welcome. And it was my local, and my friends, a couple of friends, had been talking about him that day, and it just seemed to be a weird coincidence. And I just went up and said hello.
Anne lived in Christchurch in the same neighbourhood as Ron's ex-wife, who he was sometimes granted leave to visit.
He would pop in and say hello, and the kids got to know him really, really well, and he was wonderful with them. But it wasn't like you could spend a weekend or stay the night. And the police would drive past at night without their lights on, shine a big spotlight up my drive. I'd laugh inside because he wasn't there.
But not everyone loved him.
Thing is, the public didn't want him back in this town anyway.
No, they didn't like him coming back.
No, they didn't want him here in the first place.
I think there was a large sector of the community that weren't very happy about him being here at all. I think there was a lot of people that actually hated him.
Ron was surrounded by small-town animosity and still bitter about his long prison sentence. He grew increasingly resentful of his strict parole conditions, which meant he was trapped for life in the small township of Kaikoura. He would lapse into dark moods.
Quite often he would come in about 11 o'clock in the morning, and he might say that he couldn't get up, that I want to hide under the sheets. When I see the daylight there, he said, I think I'm in prison in this caravan. He said he'd want to hide under the sheets, and he would freak out.
He called it the black dog. And even though it was great to be able to unlock the door where he lived and go outside, still felt encumbered by the rules of the parole.
By the end of 1984, Ron's black moods were becoming more frequent. 52 years old, Stuck on life parole in boring Kaikoura and reduced to a small-town crook, he still faced the terrifying possibility of being caught and jailed again. Just weeks before he went missing, he was granted permission to leave Kaikoura for 3 days.
I'd known about Ron by reputation, during my time in prison, but I'd first met him on the 23rd of November 1984. Ron and I were both invited to be guest speakers at the launch of the Criminal Bar Association in Auckland. After we all went to dinner, Ron wasn't at all depressed that night. Ron was happy. Ron was out of Kaikoura. He spoke about how much he hated Kaikoura and about how it was a confined, small society where there was nothing to do. The only thing that he seemed unhappy about was the fact that he had to return to Kaikoura.